A man who has walked the exact same path every morning for 20 years does not simply step off the edge of the world. Yet that is precisely what Judge Sir Piers Austen appeared to have done. From the tall, mullioned windows of the drawing-room, it looked as though he had been strolling across the flat, unbroken stretch of the lower lawn, a gentleman taking his constitutional in the crisp autumn air only to vanish mid-stride into the earth. There was no stumble, no cry of alarm, no frantic grasping at the empty air. One moment he was there, a rigid figure in a tweed coat leaning lightly on a silver-tipped walking stick, and the next, he was gone, swallowed by the grounds of his own estate. When the groundsman found him at the bottom of the ha-ha sunken stone wall an hour later, his neck broken, the local county police were quick to call it a tragic, inexplicable misstep. After all, the garden path was exactly as it had always been. The wall was untouched, the stone solid and dry. But a week later, the gardener's meticulously kept logbook would reveal that no groundwork had been ordered for that month, despite an entry noting the grass edge near the drop as freshly done. And no one, at least officially, could explain why, on a quiet Tuesday morning when the rest of the village was looking the other way, a scant 2 inches of green turf had been carefully, deliberately recut and moved outward over the abyss. 2 inches of unsupported grass. 2 inches that turned a routine morning walk into a flawless execution. But to understand how Sir Piers fell, and why the earth itself seemed to betray him, one must first look at the people who gathered in the biting wind to bury him, and the questions they left entirely unanswered. Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome to Midnight Pages. Chapter 1, The Funeral Bell. The bell of St. Jude's tolled with the sort of heavy, measured finality that perfectly suited a man like Judge Sir Piers Austen. It was a bleak, windswept Thursday in Charnley, the kind of Warwickshire afternoon where the damp seems to seep directly into the bone. The sky was the colour of bruised slate, heavy with the threat of an impending downpour, and the mourners huddled in tight knots of black wool and dark umbrellas around the open grave. Sir Piers had been 72, a retired circuit judge known for a scrupulous, almost chilling fairness. He had not been a warmly loved man in the village, but he had been deeply respected, which in the tight-knit hierarchy of an English parish often amounts to the exact same thing. Standing near the perimeter of the gathered crowd, positioned neatly between a crumbling headstone and a weeping willow, an elderly lady wrapped in a sensible tweed coat and a soft, lilac woolen scarf observed the proceedings with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Miss Jane Marple was currently staying at Whitmore House as the guest of Lady Whitmore. She possessed a lifelong, incurable habit of watching people, particularly when they thought they were performing the necessary social rituals properly. Funerals, she had often found over the years, were excellent places to observe the living. The dead, after all, had no more secrets to keep. It was the living who fidgeted, who overcompensated, who revealed the cracks in their composure. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the vicar droned on, his voice swallowed by the wind. Miss Marple let her pale blue eyes drift across the faces of the congregation. The most visible, overwhelming grief belonged to Evelyn Denny. At 38, Evelyn was typically a striking, poised woman, a fixture of local society who ran her father's household and affairs with military precision. But today, her composure had entirely crumbled. She wept openly, a heavy, theatrical sobbing that shook her shoulders beneath her immaculate dark wool coat. She was leaning heavily on the arm of her father, Horace Denny. The local businessman, by contrast, stood completely rigid. His thick neck bulged slightly over his starched collar, his face an unreadable, stony mask as he stared straight ahead at the polished oak coffin descending into the earth. 20 years ago, Sir Piers had presided over a massive fraud case involving Horace Denny, a case that had been abruptly dismissed on a procedural technicality involving lost evidence, a ruling that half the village still quietly whispered about. Yet here were the Dennys, occupying the front row of mourners, displaying the profound sorrow of devoted friends. As the vicar concluded the service and the crowd began to slowly fracture and disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking a few paces behind Evelyn and Horace. The vicar's wife, a nervous woman who always felt the need to fill silence, fluttered up to them. "Oh, Miss Denny," the vicar's wife murmured, pressing a handkerchief to her own dry eyes. "It is just too dreadful. To lose him so suddenly, and in such a terrible way." Evelyn stopped on the gravel path. She pressed her black-gloved hands to her face, her chest heaving with a fresh wave of grief. "It is," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly over the rustle of damp, dying leaves. "It is simply unimaginable. He was always so careful on that path. I can't understand it. He knew every inch of that garden. He walked it every day. It makes no sense at all." Miss Marple's head tilted infinitesimally. She stopped to adjust the collar of her tweed coat, her mind whirring behind a placid, grandmotherly expression. A perfectly natural sentiment, of course. Sudden death always provoked disbelief. And yet, the phrasing. He was always so careful on that path. It was an oddly specific detail to fixate upon amidst the overwhelming, generalized shock of a sudden death. To comment on his usual care meant one had observed it closely. It suggested an intimate familiarity with his exact movements along the ha-ha, a studied knowledge of where he placed his feet, rather than a broad lament for his passing. It was the remark of someone who had thought deeply about the mechanics of the fall. "Come along, Evelyn," Horace grunted, his voice a low rumble. "The wind is picking up." As the Dennys moved toward the lych gate, Miss Marple let her gaze drift past the boundaries of the churchyard toward the distant edge of Whitmore House's sunken garden, visible through the skeletal autumn trees. From this vantage point, she could just make out the heavy oak garden gate that led to the lower path where the judge had met his end. It was an odd sort of gate, designed specifically to swing only inward, toward the formal garden, never outward toward the wilder pasture. Today, however, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. The gate was shut tight, but it was latched in a strange, strained position, its heavy iron hasp jammed awkwardly against the wooden post as if it had been forced. Several villagers walked right past it on the adjacent lane, their heads bowed against the wind. Even Inspector Culworth, a stolid, sensible man from the county force who was attending the funeral purely as a matter of official courtesy, strode by without giving the gate a second glance. Culworth's mind was evidently elsewhere. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his eyes kept darting aggressively toward a young man standing sulkily near the yew trees. Philip Crane, the gardener's son. Philip was glaring at the muddy ground, pointedly refusing to look at the grave, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn corduroy jacket. He looked cornered, defensive, and thoroughly angry. Miss Marple tightened her scarf against the chill. Sir Piers had fallen to his death because he had misjudged the edge of a path he knew blindly. Evelyn Denny could not understand it, yet she knew precisely how careful he always was. Inspector Culworth was staring daggers at a resentful, hot-headed young man. And a heavy oak garden gate, which ought to swing freely on its hinges, was wedged shut as if hiding a secret of its own. To understand what was happening today, Miss Marple thought to herself as she followed the mourners out of the churchyard, one really had to know what had happened the week before. And she fully intended to find out. Chapter 2: The Inspector's Notebook. 7 days earlier. The atmosphere in the library of Whitmore House was stifling, the air heavy with the smell of old leather bindings, pipe tobacco, an impending crisis. Inspector Culworth sat rigidly in a wing-back chair near the fireplace, his thick notebook balanced on his knee, his pen poised. He was the very picture of methodical, unimaginative county policing, a man who liked his facts square, his motives obvious, and his suspects neatly boxed. "It is a profound tragedy, Lady Whitmore," Culworth was saying, tapping his fountain pen methodically against the lined page. "A great loss to the county. But I must be frank with you. My men have examined the grounds. Accidents do not manufacture themselves out of thin air. And a man of Sir Piers's habits does not simply walk off a wall he knows is there." Lady Whitmore, a fragile woman who looked as though she might shatter if spoken to too loudly, sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing a lace handkerchief between her trembling fingers. "He was an old man, Inspector," she replied, her voice frail and defensive. "He was 72. His eyesight was not what it was in his youth. The grass was wet. He must have slipped. His eyesight was perfectly fine when he drove his motorcar to the village on Monday to attend the parish council meeting," Culworth countered smoothly, refusing to yield the point. "And his walking stick was found at the bottom of the wall, gripped tightly in his hand. If he had slipped, he would have dropped it to break his fall. No, my lady. I am looking for a disruption in his routine. A distraction. Or, perhaps, a disturbance." He turned a page in his notebook, the sound loud in the quiet room. Miss Marple, sitting inconspicuously in the corner near the window with a basket of pale pink yarn, let the rhythm of her knitting needles slow just a fraction. She found Inspector Culworth's bluntness somewhat lacking in tact, but his logic was sound. "I have spoken to several people in the village this morning," Culworth continued, leaning forward. "And it seems Sir Piers was involved in a rather violent, public altercation roughly 2 weeks ago. With young Philip Crane." Lady Whitmore sighed, a sound of profound fatigue. She closed her eyes. "Philip is hot-headed, Inspector. Like his father. It was a foolish dispute over wages and the maintenance of the new greenhouse. Sir Piers was exacting. He demanded a standard of work the boy felt was unreasonable. Unreasonable enough to result in a shouting match in the middle of the high street." Culworth asked, his eyebrows raising skeptically. The baker's wife heard young Philip tell Sir Piers, quite clearly, that he would see him in the ground before he took another order from him. A rather damning choice of words, given the circumstances. A figure of speech, surely, Lady Whitmore protested weakly. "The boy is dramatic, not murderous." "Perhaps. But figures of speech have a nasty habit of becoming literal when tempers flare," Culworth snapped, shutting the notebook with a sharp crack. "I intend to question the boy thoroughly. I need to know exactly his whereabouts on the morning of the fall. If he cannot account for his time on Tuesday morning, I shall have to bring him in for a formal interview. You will find him perfectly well accounted for, Inspector, a smooth, calm voice said from the doorway. Culworth twisted in his chair. Evelyn Denny stood in the threshold of the library, holding a small wicker basket covered with a checked linen cloth. She stepped into the room with an air of absolute, unshakable assurance, bringing with her the crisp scent of autumn air and expensive perfume. "I beg your pardon, Miss Denny," Culworth said, stiffening, clearly displeased at the interruption. "Philip Crane," Evelyn said, offering a faint, highly sympathetic smile as she glided further into the room. "I couldn't help overhearing the end of your conversation." The door was ajar. "If you are wondering about the boy's whereabouts, Inspector, you needn't trouble him or his poor father. He was at the village fete all afternoon." "The fete?" Culworth repeated, frowning. "Yes. He was helping my father and me run the tombola stall," Evelyn explained, setting her basket on a side table. "He didn't leave our sight for hours. We kept him exceedingly busy fetching prizes and making change. Dozens of people can vouch for it. He was thoroughly occupied the entire time." Culworth's frown deepened, his pen hovering over the notebook. He was clearly annoyed at having his prime suspect's alibi neatly and efficiently handed to him by the daughter of the town's wealthiest man. "I see," Culworth muttered, jotting something down. "At the fete? On Saturday afternoon?" "Exactly," Evelyn said brightly. "I merely came to drop off some of Cook's marmalade for Lady Whitmore. I know how fond Sir Piers was of it. I shall leave you to your official business, Inspector." As Evelyn turned and departed with a soft rustle of wool, Culworth muttered something under his breath to Lady Whitmore about having to verify the stall rotas anyway, just to be thorough. But Miss Marple simply kept knitting, her needles clicking together in a steady, thoughtful rhythm. Saturday afternoon, she thought to herself. The village fete was indeed on Saturday. And Philip Crane had likely been there, exactly as Evelyn said. But Sir Piers had not fallen on Saturday. He had fallen on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn Denny, a highly intelligent and organized woman, had just effortlessly provided a perfect, ironclad alibi for the entirely wrong day. And nobody in the room but a quietly knitting old woman had noticed the sleight of hand. If Evelyn was so eager to provide an alibi for Saturday, ensuring the police focused their attention on the weekend, what on earth had happened on Friday? Or earlier? To find out, one had to look at the day before the tragedy. Chapter 3: The Last Good Morning. The day before the fall. The morning was crisp, windless, and brilliantly clear, the sort of late autumn day that made the grand stonework of Whitmore House glow like pale, aged honey in the early light. Frost still clung to the shadows beneath the rhododendrons. Precisely at 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany front door opened, and Sir Piers Austen stepped out onto the terrace, his silver-tipped walking stick tapping a familiar, authoritative rhythm against the flagstones. From the vantage point of her second-floor bedroom window, Miss Marple watched him. She had always been an early riser, finding that the first, unguarded hour of the day often revealed a household's truest character. Sir Piers moved with the stiff, unyielding posture of a man who firmly believed the world should conform to his rules, his schedule, and his absolute authority. He wore a heavy tweed jacket, a woolen flat cap pulled low against the glare of the rising sun, and polished leather boots that crunched rhythmically on the gravel. He followed his invariable route, a path he had worn into the fabric of the estate over 2 decades. He descended the wide terrace steps, walked across the dew-soaked upper lawn, and approached the heavy oak garden gate that separated the formal, manicured gardens from the sweeping, untamed view of the lower pasture. Miss Marple watched carefully as he reached the gate. He lifted the iron latch. The gate swung inward, toward Sir Piers, as he pulled it open. It moved smoothly on its heavy iron hinges, functioning exactly as it was meant to, sweeping silently over the short grass. He stepped through the gap, turned, and let the gate swing back and latch behind him with a solid, satisfying clack that carried clearly up to the second-floor window. He then began his walk along the top of the ha-ha. It was an architectural marvel, the ha-ha at Whitmore House. Designed in the late 18th century by a landscape architect obsessed with unbroken vistas, it was a deep, dry trench with a sheer retaining stone wall on the side facing the house, and a sloped, grassy incline on the side facing the pasture. From the drawing room on the ground floor, looking out, the eye saw only a continuous, unbroken sweep of green lawn rolling effortlessly into the distance. The vertical drop, a sheer stone wall some 8 feet deep, was completely invisible until one was practically standing on the edge. It was an illusion of infinite space, a barrier designed specifically not to be seen, keeping livestock out without interrupting the aristocratic view. Sir Piers walked the narrow path that ran parallel to that invisible edge. He did not look down. He did not need to. For 20 years, he had walked this exact line, his muscle memory guiding him flawlessly, keeping his boots exactly 2 feet from the sheer drop. He paused near the old stone sundial midway along the path, struck the ground once with his walking stick, and breathed in the cold morning air, looking out over the rolling hills of Warwickshire. Nothing was amiss. The grass was wet with heavy dew, but utterly undisturbed. The stones of the wall held firm. The world was exactly as it should be. Sir Piers turned on his heel and walked back along the same path, passing through the oak gate once more, the latch clicking securely shut behind him as he returned to the house for breakfast. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple would take a quiet turn around the garden herself, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She would pass the gate, noting its heavy iron construction, and she would stand near the edge of the ha-ha, marveling at how abruptly the solid ground simply vanished into thin air. It required an immense amount of confidence to walk that edge daily. The sort of blind confidence that comes from absolute certainty in one's surroundings, a belief that the ground will always be where it has always been. If a man possessed that certainty, he would never fall. He would never misjudge his footing by a margin large enough to kill him. Not unless the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. And worlds, Miss Marple knew, do not shift on their own. They are pushed. They are altered. What, she wondered, as she stared down at the stones 8 feet below, had brought such a deliberate push into this quiet, ordered garden? For that answer, one had to look at the visitors who had come calling earlier in the week, bearing gifts. Chapter 4, The Jam She Brought. It was a Wednesday, 5 days before the tragic misstep. The air inside Whitmore House smelled faintly of wood smoke, floor wax, and polished brass. Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, surrounded by lush ferns and the heavy scent of orchids, attempting to read a rather dense volume on border perennials. She looked up as Evelyn Denny was shown in by the parlour maid. Evelyn was a frequent visitor to the house, though her presence always seemed to carry a slight, electrical charge of tension. Today, she was delivering a large wicker basket of homemade preserves, a neighbourly, traditional gesture that Horace Denny's daughter performed with flawless aristocratic grace, despite the village's persistent snobbery regarding her family's wealth being rooted in trade rather than land. Sir Piers, who had been reading legal journals in his study, came out into the hall to greet her. He was polite, impeccably so, though his jaw was set with a rigidity that Miss Marple recognized instantly from her vantage point among the ferns. It was the face of a seasoned magistrate forced to endure the presence of someone he deeply, fundamentally distrusted. "Evelyn," Sir Piers said, his tone dry and entirely devoid of warmth. "How thoughtful of you. Your father's orchards must be overproducing again this year." "Father likes to ensure nothing goes to waste, Sir Piers," Evelyn replied, her smile bright, practiced, and unyielding. "He has always believed in maximizing returns. He asked me to bring the blackberry and the apricot. He knows they are your favorites." The exchange hovered dangerously on the edge of rudeness, a subtle, cold fencing match masked entirely by the language of village pleasantries. "Indeed," Sir Piers said, glancing at the grandfather clock. "I was just about to go for a short stroll in the garden before the rain sets in." He clearly wished to terminate the conversation and retreat to his routine. "Oh, I'll walk with you," Evelyn offered immediately, adjusting the collar of her coat. "If you don't mind. I wanted to ask your advice on some winter planting anyway. Father's gardeners are hopeless with the frost." Sir Piers could not refuse without being outright uncivil. He nodded stiffly, and the two of them set off across the terrace and down onto the lawn. From the conservatory windows, Miss Marple watched their progress. They walked side by side, keeping a polite distance, heading toward the lower lawn. They reached the heavy oak gate that led to the ha-ha path. Evelyn, stepping ahead, reached out to open it. Miss Marple frowned slightly, setting her book down on her lap. Evelyn did not pull the gate inward, as was entirely natural and mechanically correct. Instead, she grasped the iron latch, braced her shoulder, and awkwardly forced her weight against it, shoving the heavy wood slightly outward, a highly unnatural motion for a gate explicitly designed to swing the other way. The bottom of the gate scraped harshly against the turf, sticking firmly for a moment. "Allow me," Sir Piers said, reaching over her arm. He pulled the gate properly inward, and it swung open with ease. Evelyn laughed, a sharp, clear sound that carried across the lawn to the conservatory. "How clumsy of me! I always forget which way it opens. My apologies, Sir Piers." They walked along the edge of the ha-ha, Evelyn gesturing broadly to the lower pasture, pointing at the distant tree line while Sir Piers nodded stiffly. To anyone else, it looked like a woman asking for gardening advice. But Miss Marple, watching the way Evelyn's eyes darted to the ground, the way she seemed to measure the distance between the judge's boots and the edge of the drop, felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The ha-ha was a brilliant, deadly piece of landscaping. Miss Marple knew how it worked. It created an optical illusion of a continuous lawn, hiding an 8-foot vertical drop. Because it was invisible from a distance, anyone approaching it relied entirely on visual cues at the very last second, or, in Sir Piers's case, deeply ingrained habit. If you altered the edge, if you somehow changed where the solid ground ended and the empty air began, the victim would have no way of knowing until they had already put their weight on nothingness. Evelyn and Sir Piers stayed out for perhaps 20 minutes before Evelyn departed, leaving the basket of jam on the hall table. It was only later that afternoon, when the old gardener, Mr. Crane, came up to the kitchen door for his tea, that Miss Marple noticed a strange detail. She was in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, when she glanced casually at the open page of the gardener's daily logbook resting on the counter. Wednesday, 14th, clipped yews. Dead-headed roses. Lower garden edge by the wall freshly done. Miss Marple blinked. She had been observing the garden all morning. No one, not Mr. Crane, nor his son Philip, had been working near the ha-ha. Why would the edge be noted as freshly done? And why had Evelyn Denny, a woman who had visited Whitmore House countless times since she was a child, suddenly forgotten how to open a gate she had walked through 100 times? The answers, she suspected, were deeply rooted in a dinner party that had taken place in this very house just a few nights prior. Chapter 5: The Dinner That Was Not Quiet. 10 days before the fall. The dining room at Whitmore House was bathed in the warm, flickering light of silver candelabras. The crystal gleamed, the heavy mahogany table was set with flawless precision, but from the moment the clear turtle soup was served, the atmosphere had been thick with a palpable, unspoken hostility. It was meant to be a small, intimate gathering. Lady Whitmore sat at one end, nervously twisting her napkin. Sir Piers anchored the other. Horace Denny sat to the right, his daughter Evelyn beside him, and the local vicar, oblivious to the tension, ate his soup with gusto. Miss Marple, invited as Lady Whitmore's houseguest, ate quietly, her eyes moving rapidly from face to face, reading the room like a highly complex novel. Horace Denny was holding court, his booming, overly confident voice filling the room, dominating the conversation in a way that clearly grated on his host. "It's all about modernization now, Piers," Horace said, waving a piece of bread for emphasis. "The old ways of doing business in this county, handshakes, gentlemen's agreements, relying on pedigree, they're dead. Buried. You have to adapt, you have to be aggressive, or you get left behind in the mud." Sir Piers set his silver spoon down on his porcelain saucer with a sharp, ringing clink. "There is a profound difference, Horace," Sir Piers said, his voice dropping to a low, icy register, "between modernization and moral compromise. Some boundaries in business, and in life, are not meant to be crossed. When a man begins to believe that the rules no longer apply to him, that he can purchase his own reality, he inevitably invites ruin." The table went completely silent. The vicar stopped chewing. Evelyn Denny's hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass so hard her knuckles turned white. Horace's face flushed a dull, mottled red, the veins in his neck standing out against his collar. Everyone in the room, perhaps save the vicar, knew exactly what Sir Piers was referring to. 20 years ago, the massive fraud case against Horace had miraculously collapsed. It remained the only significant blemish on Sir Piers's long judicial record, a case he was forced to dismiss due to a sudden, inexplicable loss of key financial documents from the prosecution's securely locked file. The entire village knew Horace had bought his way out, bribing someone on the inside, but no one had ever been able to prove a thing. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Piers," Horace said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, warning rumble. "I mean," Sir Piers said, leaning slightly forward, his eyes locked onto Horace with cold, terrifying steadiness, "that the truth has a remarkable, relentless habit of surfacing, Horace. Even after 20 years. Papers thought lost are sometimes found in old boxes. Letters thought burned to ash are sometimes kept in a bottom drawer as insurance. And when they finally come to light, the past must be answered for. In full." Evelyn's head snapped up. She stared at Sir Piers, her dark eyes wide, calculating, and suddenly filled with a cold light. A look of pure, crystalline understanding passed over her elegant features. She handled all her father's affairs. She knew exactly what documents existed. She knew exactly what he was threatening. Before the tension could shatter into an open, screaming argument, a loud crash echoed from the terrace outside. The heavy French doors were violently flung open, and young Philip Crane stood there, panting. His boots were caked in mud, his face pale and twisted with fury. "I'm not doing it!" Philip shouted, pointing a trembling, dirt-stained finger directly at Sir Piers. "You can dock my wages, you can sack me, but I won't be treated like a dog. You're a tyrant, Sir Piers, and everyone on this estate knows it." "Philip!" Lady Whitmore gasped, clutching her chest. "Have you lost your mind?" Sir Piers stood up slowly, tossing his napkin onto the table. "You are drunk, Philip. Go home immediately. We will discuss the termination of your employment in the morning." Philip spat a foul curse onto the Aubusson rug, turned on his heel, and vanished back into the darkness. The dinner party was effectively ruined. Lady Whitmore fluttered about, apologizing profusely. Horace muttered loudly about the insolence of the working classes. But Miss Marple was not looking at the angry young man retreating into the night, nor at the outraged host. She was looking exclusively at Evelyn Denny. Evelyn was staring at the empty space where Philip had stood, a slow, highly thoughtful expression settling over her face. She was a woman who had just seen her father's impending doom pronounced, and who had simultaneously, miraculously, been handed the perfect, angry young scapegoat. But what, precisely, had Sir Piers found to make him so bold after 2 decades? Chapter 6: The Gardener's Log. The pieces were beginning to assemble in Miss Marple's mind, clicking together like a complex mosaic finally coming into sharp focus. It was the afternoon immediately following the funeral, and she sat alone in the quiet warmth of Lady Whitmore's morning room, a cup of tea growing cold on the small table beside her. She had asked Lady Whitmore for permission to look through the gardener's logbook, framing the request as a sweet, elderly interest in local horticulture and soil management. The heavy, leather-bound ledger now sat open on her lap, turned to the week before Sir Piers's death. She traced her finger slowly down the page, finding the exact entry she had spotted briefly in the kitchen days ago. Wednesday, 14th, clipped yews along the East Drive. Dead-headed remaining roses. Lower garden edge by the wall freshly done. Miss Marple tapped her index finger lightly against her lips. Freshly done. Old Mr. Crane was a meticulous, highly literal man. If he wrote in his official log that the edge was freshly done, he meant that the turf had been formerly cut with a steel edging iron, leaving a crisp, dark line of exposed, damp soil separating the grass from the drop. But old Crane had not done it himself. And he hadn't ordered his son to do it. He had merely observed it while doing his rounds, assuming that his son Philip or perhaps a temporary day labourer had carried out the task without being told. Miss Marple closed her eyes, visualizing the precise geometry of the garden. The heavy oak gate that swung only inward. The narrow path running alongside the ha-ha. The sheer, invisible 8-foot drop to the stones below. If someone were to take a sharp spade and a heavy edging iron, if they were to slice the turf cleanly along the edge of the ha-ha, they could lift the grass like a thick carpet. They could pull it outward, extending the grass a mere 2 inches over the empty air. 2 inches of turf supported by absolutely nothing but its own intertwined roots and a bit of packed dirt. It would look completely identical to the rest of the solid lawn. It would blend perfectly. But it would bear no weight whatsoever. Anyone walking their usual path, planting their walking stick or the heel of their boot exactly 2 feet from where they deeply believed the edge to be, would step squarely on that false lip. The turf would give way instantly under the weight of a grown man. They would fall forward, and the turf would snap back or crumble in a way that looked exactly like a natural, unfortunate crumbling of the bank due to weather. But who could execute such a thing? And why the bizarre behavior with the gate? Miss Marple recalled Evelyn pulling the gate outward, wedging it awkwardly against the grass on that Wednesday visit. If the turf had been moved outward the day before on Tuesday morning, the gate's natural inward swing would scrape directly against the newly exposed, damp edge of the shifted soil, smearing it and revealing the tampering. Evelyn had wedged it outward when walking with Sir Piers to prevent the heavy wood from smearing the fresh cut while the judge was looking right at it. She was protecting her work until the earth had dried and settled. And the gardener had simply noticed the dark, damp line of newly cut soil the next day, assuming it was routine maintenance. It was a brilliantly simple, devastatingly effective trap. But what had driven Evelyn to commit such a precise, cold-blooded act of engineering? What had Sir Piers discovered that made his sudden death an absolute necessity? The answer, Miss Marple knew, had to lie in the judge's private study, among the papers he had been reviewing the week before he died. Chapter 7. What Sir Piers Found. 2 weeks before the fall. It was late evening, and the sprawling house was utterly silent save for the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. Sir Piers was alone in his study, sitting in a leather wingback chair beneath the focused pool of light from a green glass banker's lamp. He had spent the last 3 days meticulously sorting through dusty boxes of old legal files. They had been unexpectedly returned to him by the widow of his former chief clerk, who was clearing out her attic. Most of the contents were administrative rubbish, old schedules, faded receipts, mundane correspondence. But at the bottom of the 3rd box, wedged tightly inside a faded, unmarked manila folder, he had found it. It was a letter. Handwritten, dated 20 years ago, on the heavy, cream-colored, unmistakable stationery of Horace Denny's primary business firm. It was addressed to the lead prosecutor of the fraud case, detailing a massive, highly complex, and completely untraceable transfer of funds to a numbered Swiss bank account. It explicitly thanked the prosecutor for ensuring the relevant ledgers are unfortunately misplaced before trial. It was the missing piece of evidence. The smoking gun. the document that definitively proved the prosecution had been bought and paid for, the document that explained exactly why Sir Piers had been legally forced to dismiss the case on procedural grounds. Sir Piers read the letter again, the paper trembling slightly in his grip, his jaw muscles clenching so hard his teeth ached. For 20 years, he had lived with the bitter, acidic stain of that trial. He had known, in his bones, that justice had been perverted in his own courtroom, right under his nose, but he had lacked a single shred of proof to act upon. Now, after 2 decades, he held the proof in his hands. Horace Denny had bribed an officer of the court. He had bought his freedom. And Evelyn, his devoted, fiercely protective daughter, who managed all her father's accounts and private correspondence, would have known exactly what her father had done. She might have even arranged the transfer herself. Sir Piers carefully placed the letter in his top desk drawer and locked it with a small brass key. He knew he could not simply reopen a criminal trial on his own authority. He was retired, stripped of his bench. The local county police would drag their feet against a man as wealthy and deeply entrenched as Horace Denny. No, there was only one way to ensure justice was finally, ruthlessly served. He would write to the national press. He would send verified copies of the letter to the editors of the major papers in London. The scandal would break like a thunderstorm, Horace Denny would be publicly ruined, his assets seized, and the agonizing stain on Sir Piers's professional conscience would finally be washed clean. He had hinted at it at the dinner party. He wanted Horace to sweat. He wanted the man to lose sleep, to know that the reckoning he had dodged for 20 years had finally arrived at his doorstep. It was a massive mistake, of course. A fatal miscalculation born of elderly pride and a rigid, unyielding sense of righteousness. By warning his enemy, by indulging in the satisfaction of a threat, Sir Piers had sealed his own fate. Evelyn Denny was not a woman who allowed her family to be destroyed. She had listened to his threat at the dinner table, watched the angry gardener's son storm into the room making violent threats, and she had immediately begun to plan. All she needed was a garden trowel, an edging iron, and an alibi for the boy she fully intended to frame. Chapter 8: Philip Crane's Account. I didn't touch him. I swear to God, I wasn't even near the main house that morning. Philip Crane stood in the center of the estate kitchen, his tweed cap crumpled tightly in his dirt-stained hands. His chest was heaving with panic. Inspector Culworth stood opposite him, looking entirely immovable, a notebook in his hand and a deeply skeptical set to his jaw. Miss Marple sat quietly at the heavy oak kitchen table, carefully slicing an apple with a small paring knife, seemingly entirely focused on keeping the peel in one long, unbroken ribbon. You admit you threatened him in front of witnesses, Culworth said, his voice flat and relentless. You admit you were seen arguing with him in the village. The baker's wife heard you say you'd see him in the ground before you took another order from him. Those were your words, were they not? I was angry, Philip said, his voice cracking. I say stupid things when I'm angry. Everyone does. I didn't mean I would never. And on the morning of the fall, Culworth pressed, you claim you were fixing the fences in the lower pasture. Alone. In the fog. With no one to corroborate your story whatsoever. I was down by the woods all morning, hammering rails. Philip's panic was making him louder than was wise. I didn't see anyone. I didn't go near the ha-ha. I didn't do anything to the wall. You have to believe me. It's a very convenient story, Culworth noted, turning a page in his notebook. And yet, Miss Denny was exceedingly eager to provide you with an alibi. Why would she do that, do you suppose? Philip blinked. Some of the panic left his face, replaced by genuine bewilderment. I don't know. She's always been decent enough. Her father's not, but she's always been civil to the workers. Better than most. She told me you were at the fete all Saturday afternoon helping with the tombola, Culworth said. Is that true? Yes, but what does Saturday have to do with anything? Philip's eyes darted between the inspector and the old woman at the table. The judge died on Tuesday morning. I was in the lower pasture Tuesday morning. Saturday's got nothing to do with it. Miss Marple paused, her paring knife hovering mid-air. She placed it down on the wooden board with great care. Inspector, she said, her voice perfectly mild. If I might interject a very small thought. Culworth exhaled. Though he was annoyed by the interruption, he turned toward her. Miss Marple. It strikes me, she said, folding her hands in her lap, that Miss Denny is a highly capable woman. She manages an entire business empire for her father, single-handed by most accounts. A woman of that intelligence does not confuse her days of the week. If she provided Philip with an alibi for Saturday, it was because she intended to draw attention to Saturday. And if she drew attention to Saturday, she had a particular reason to need Tuesday left unexamined. Culworth frowned. She was confused. Or she was protecting him out of misguided sympathy. A woman who has never in her life acted from misguided sympathy, Miss Marple said gently, does not begin to do so in the middle of a police investigation into a suspicious death. An alibi offered before it is asked for is almost always a misdirection. The question is never what day the alibi covers. The question is always which day it was designed to conceal. The kitchen was very quiet. Philip Crane was watching Miss Marple with an expression that had moved from panic into something closer to awe. Culworth stood completely still, his pen suspended over the notebook, the full weight of what she was saying settling slowly onto his shoulders. She knew, he said at last, his voice changed. She already knew Tuesday was the critical morning. Before I told her. Before anyone told her. Yes, Miss Marple said. She did. She looked out the kitchen window toward the lower lawn and the invisible edge of the ha-ha, its drop hidden as thoroughly as any secret Charnley had ever kept. If you wish to know exactly how Sir Piers died, she said quietly, you must stop looking for an angry man who pushed him. You must look for a woman who moved the earth itself. 2 inches. Very quietly. On a Tuesday morning when the rest of the village was looking the other way. Chapter 9, The Afternoon No One Remembers. Tuesday. The day it was done. The estate was wrapped in the deep, heavy quiet of a mid-morning in autumn. Lady Whitmore was resting in her room with a migraine. Sir Piers had taken his motorcar into the village to attend a parish council committee meeting. The old gardener was at the far end of the sprawling estate, burning a massive pile of damp leaves, the smoke rising thick and grey against the sky. Evelyn Denny walked down the long gravel driveway, a woven basket hooked casually over her arm. She was dressed in sensible tweeds, looking for all the world like a friendly neighbor dropping in for a casual morning visit. But inside the basket, hidden carefully beneath a red checked cloth, was a heavy steel edging iron and a deeply sharpened gardening trowel. She moved quickly and silently across the damp grass of the upper lawn, her eyes fixed intently on the precise line of the ha-ha. She knew Sir Piers's rigid habits perfectly. She had observed him for years. She knew exactly where he walked, exactly how far from the edge he placed his silver-tipped stick, and exactly how heavily he leaned on it when he paused to look at the view. She reached the heavy oak gate. She pulled it open, stepped through onto the narrow path, and set her basket gently on the grass. Working with breathtaking speed, physical strength, and brutal precision, she drove the heavy steel edging iron deep into the turf, measuring exactly 2 feet from the stone retaining wall. She sliced a neat, perfectly straight line parallel to the drop, cutting a strip about 10 feet long. Dropping the iron, she took the sharp trowel and carefully severed the thick, fibrous roots beneath the grass, lifting a long, continuous strip of turf like a heavy green ribbon. With slow, deliberate care, sweating slightly in the cool air, she moved the entire strip of turf outward. Just 2 inches. She packed loose, damp soil beneath the back edge to stabilize it, pressing it down firmly so the seam where she had cut was entirely invisible. The front edge of the turf now protruded out over the sheer, 8-foot drop of the stone wall, 2 inches of unsupported, floating grass, waiting patiently for a heavy foot to find it. She stood back, breathing heavily, and brushed the dark dirt from her thick leather gloves. It was perfect. To the naked eye, the path looked exactly as it always had. The geometry of the garden remained completely undisturbed. But the safety margin, the crucial 2 inches of solid earth the judge relied upon, was gone. Evelyn picked up her basket and hid the tools beneath the cloth. She stepped back through the heavy oak gate. As she did, acting on pure instinct, she let the heavy gate swing shut naturally behind her. Clack! The heavy iron and wood swung inward, as it was designed to do. But now, the turf of the path was 2 inches closer to the gate's arc. The heavy bottom edge of the oak gate scraped hard against the freshly cut, damp line of soil she had just moved, pressing the dirt flat and leaving a dark, wet smudge that old Mr. Crane would spot the very next day and assume was routine maintenance. Evelyn froze, staring at the gate. She instantly realized her mistake. The gate would continually smear the cut line every time it was opened until the soil dried and the grass roots took hold again. When she returned tomorrow to deliver the jam and walk the grounds with Sir Piers to scout her handiwork, she would have to forcefully wedge the gate open backward to prevent it from disturbing the earth while he was looking right at it. And on the day of the funeral, when the ground was soaked with rain and the false edge had collapsed under the judge's weight, she would have to wedge the gate shut entirely, jamming the iron hasp so no one would swing it and notice the glaring discrepancy in the clearance. She reached out, latched the gate securely, turned her back on the ha-ha, and walked away across the lawn without looking back. The trap was set. Tomorrow, she would ensure Sir Piers walked this path to admire the view. And tomorrow, a judge who refused to let the past die, a man who believed the ground beneath his feet was unshakable, would simply step off the edge of the world. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'm Jack. This has been Midnight Pages, and if this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave me a thought in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, Share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and watch what grows in the quiet places.